inclusivity in all of its forms in El Paso and throughout the state and throughout the country. We call this freedom for people with disabilities because that is what all of us crave. We all want to be free. And we're going to talk about how the ADA helped people with disabilities access freedom. We are joined by some incredible panelists. As we've said before, the purpose of these roundtables is to talk about two things. One is how do we become more awake? And then also how do we realize that the awakening is not the end all be all? We need to rise. We need to address these issues in a way that's meaningful and sustainable. We are not being endorsed by any of the panelists' organizations. They're here representing different organizations, but they are not endorsing us through the organizations. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. You can go ahead and send us comments through the Facebook comment, as well as if you're watching us on Twitter, you can do that as well. And we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna call on some of our guests, and the first one will be Anita Cameron.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anita Cameron. I'm in New York, so we're a little, it's about 8 something here. But my name's Anita Cameron. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am director of Minority Outreach for Not Dead Yet, which is a national disability rights organization. People in the disability community, generally, when they hear my name, they associate it with ADAPT because I have been a member of ADAPT for 34 years now. And yeah, that's where I did most of was arrested 139 times over 34 years in ADAPT. And so I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Anita, for joining us. Can you describe yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have very low vision myself. So I am a Black woman with very long locks, what some people call dreadlocks, but long locks. I am wearing a Black t-shirt with the ADAPT logo in white. It says, it's kind of like in a circular, and it says free our people. And it has a person in wheelchairs breaking chains. And beneath it, it says ADAPT.
Thank you, Anita. Christy, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Christy Lai, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a Latina woman with curly grayish hair, and I'm wearing some dangly silvery earrings, and I have a coffee pot in the background. And that's about it.
Thank you, Christy. George?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is George. I'm wearing a white shirt with a tie, different color ties. I am visually impaired. I do have glasses on. The background is here in my office. And first of all, Mrs. Carvajal, thank you for inviting us. And my background real quick, I was lucky enough to serve on the City Accessibility Advisory Committee, both chair on that, the Mass Transit Board chair also, and then the Fair Housing Task Force. And I'm currently full-time employment with the Texas Attorney General Child Support Division. And then I am host of the No Vision Internet Radio and the Accessibility Corner.
Thank you, George. Josue? I think you might be muted. Josue, are you muted?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Josue Rodriguez. I'm an organizer with ADAPT, with Desert ADAPT. I'm a Hispanic male, black hair, brown eyes, wearing a white t-shirt. And I am also a president of Grupo Dignidad Igualdad de Oportunidad in El Paso, a Hispanic group for people with disabilities. And that was it, correct?
Yes, thank you. Charles?
Yes, hello, my name is Charles. My last name is Johnson. I go by CJ. I'm deaf, and I'm a deaf advocate, an ASL advocate, and I work with signing with CJ, and I teach ASL at Burgess High School and at the college. I'm studying at Gallaudet, and I go by his and him, and I'm a white man with a shaved head, a beard, and my background's green, and I have a gray hoodie on. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Charles, for being with us. Thank you. Okay, just sending off a couple of notes. So I think I forgot to introduce myself. I am Veronica Carvajal. I am a candidate for mayor, and I am a Latina with brown hair, brown eyes, and fairly light skin. And I'm wearing a suit jacket. And the background is a couple of pieces of art from El Paso that show the mountains and the poppies. And I'm really excited to be with y'all. So the American with Disabilities Act, for our audience, in case you don't know, is one of a number of civil rights acts that prohibits discrimination. And it does so against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, which includes employment, schools, transportation, and public and private spaces that are open to the general public. So if you have a small business, but it's open to the public, then it must also be accessible to people with disabilities. The purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have equal opportunity and equal access. And I practice a lot of Fair Housing Act cases, and the Fair Housing Act is similar in the fact that it provides for equal access and equal opportunity to the use of housing. And what that means sometimes is that people with disabilities are treated differently in order to get them equal access. So different treatment is allowed so long as that provides equal access to use a space. And that could mean an accommodation or a modification. An accommodation means you change the policy. The modification is that you change the space itself. So we are going to talk about the history of the ADA, as it's known, through one of our friends and for some people, their mentor, Frank Lozano, who passed away. He was from El Paso, well, he was living in El Paso, and he was an incredible human being. And so now I'm going to open it up to our speakers to talk about Frank as they knew him, and what his work was like in getting the ADA passed and in continuing the promise of the ADA.
Well, this Anita, I'll start. And I'm sorry, I'm the outsider here. I'm not from El Paso, but I knew Frank the entire time that I was in ADAPT. In fact, Frank was one of the first people in ADAPT that I met when I went on national access. Frank and I were friends. We were tight, and so I knew him. As I said, when I joined, he at one point moved to Colorado Springs, which is where I was. Atlantis. I was working for Atlantis Community, and Atlantis Community is the second oldest Center for Independent Living in the nation. And it is the home of ADAPT. It is where ADAPT got its it start. DAP was kind of the activist wing, if you will, of Atlantis. And when I moved to Colorado Springs in 87, 88, I was there to about 91. We had a satellite office in Colorado Springs. So Frank came to be with us. He moved up to Colorado Springs, for a couple of years, and he was hired to be lead organizer, at Atlantis and for this chapter of Colorado Springs Adapt. And so, it's interesting, people being people, I don't know why organizers, we just kind of didn't, for some reason, get along or work together. But because Frank and I were friends before, obviously we clicked and we rocked Colorado Springs. We did actions, trying to get lifts on their buses. We did a lot of those. We attended a lot of city hall meetings. What a lot of people, don't realize, about Frank. Frank and I, and he was the only one who worked with me on LGBTQ issues. And so Frank and I, we worked, one of the things that we did was we worked to try to get Colorado Springs to have a non-discrimination ordinance regarding those in the LGBTQ community. So, Frank was, so it wasn't just for disability rights, for him. Frank was about the rights of marginalized people. And we were, such kindred spirits, that it was so much fun working with Frank. Like I said, we rocked Colorado Springs. We opened, helped open the eyes of a lot of people to disability issues, to access issues. We were one of the ones where I'm sure if you've heard the stories of ADAPT folks taking sledgehammers and stuff to curbs and whatnot. We were part of that. And it was amazing. It was amazing to work with Frank, and then, obviously, with the ADAPT stuff, I don't even know how many times we've been arrested together, fighting for the civil rights of people with disabilities. When Frank and I was working together in Colorado Springs, that was pre-ADA. I mean, you're talking 89, 90, and so it was just, I because I don't want to take up a bunch of time, just to say that I adored Frank. Frank was like a brother to me, a mentor, my sage, kind of my Yoda. He had that kind of quiet, kind of peaceful, thing, but he was a warrior, At one point, I think Frank and I probably was the two loudest chanters in ADAPT. But I missed him. It was devastating to hear that he passed away. Just so much. Actually, Frank's passing has spurred me to to kind of begin a gathering and archiving of those early days, of ADAPT, in his memory. So yeah, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And I think, George, you also are very close to Frank.
Yeah, me and Frank, he brought me into ADAPT back in 2016. I met him at City Hall, actually. And I'm like, who's this cat? Because he was blind and I'm visually impaired. And he goes, yeah, come on in. And And I'm going to tell you a quick story here. So people, you're talking about the history of the ADA. You know, yes, it was passed in 1999, but there was a whole slew of incidents or challenges that came up before that. And I'm going to give a good analogy. I tell people, I call it my hamburger philosophy or my hamburger analogy. When you go to a restaurant and you sit down to order a burger, you don't see the whole process behind that, where they have to prep the meat, ship the meat, store the meat, cook the meat, and serve the meat. All you know is you have it in front of you and you're going to eat it. But you don't see the whole back end of what happens to get you that burger. And with Frank, he and the other people that advocate, especially that are adapt, they did things that me as a normal person that never really advocated before that, didn't really understand the concept of blocking doors or doing this or doing that. And I remember we went to a Pizza Hut, and Frank, he sorry about that.
Thank you, George.
He was fearless. And I remember what at a Pizza Hut, he got a bucket, those regular like plastic buckets. He put it in front of the door, and because the restaurant, the Pizza Hut, was not accessible, so he's like, okay, so he got the bucket put in front of the door and put a toilet seat on top of it, and he sat there, and the manager tried to come out, and Frank wouldn't move, but that's how Frank is, and that's even when we went in front of Circle K, I mean that man was fearless. Sorry about that. And many times we would go up front of City Hall. Before that, I'll call him. I'm like, hey Frank, what do we do? How do we do it? And how do we approach this? He was a lot of times he would call me. He never called me by my first name. He always called me Zavala. And he's like, tomorrow we're going to City Council. I want you there. I'm like, yes, sir. Go in there. And so he taught me, him and Mr. Lala taught me a lot how to be an advocate. And that's why I appreciate that people don't realize the history when it comes to implementation of the ADA locally here in El Paso and nationwide. It just didn't happen overnight. It's people like Frank Lada that, I mean, I heard stories, folks. I heard one story, and Mr. Josue probably could affirm this, that in Washington, D.C., folks, he had his dog, but yet the cops threw him down to the ground and even broke his ribs, but he didn't care. He was there the next day. And that's I wish I had that kind of fearless. I don't. I don't have that trait in me, unfortunately. But Frank was a good man, and he really contributed a lot to especially here in El Paso, of equal access. That's what his main game was, folks. Because honestly, if you think about it, this is a blind man, and Adapt really focuses, people in wheelchairs, but he didn't care. He wanted, because he's the true advocate. And that's what taught me, that no matter disability, we're on the same boat. So we need to advocate as one. And that's what Frank taught me. So God bless Frank, and rest in power.
Thank you, George. Thank you for sharing that with us. And Frank was visually impaired. He was blind, and he used service animals, at least for some of his journey. And Anita was telling me about the service dogs that she remembered Frank having.
Yeah, this is Anita. So, and George, I'm also, I have low vision. And when I joined ADAPT, I had my white cane with me. And Frank had, when I started going on national actions, Frank had Frazier with him. And I remember my first national action. It was an action called DC Siege DOT, Department of Transportation. And Frank, we had taken over the Department of Transportation. We were trying to get a meeting with Sam Skinner, and this was pre-ADA, trying to get lifts on buses. And I'll never forget, it was that day, it was -4 degrees out there. I was the last person to actually get inside the building because we were out there for a while, and that was where I met Frank and Frazier. And Fraser was amazing. That was an amazing dog. Calm. Um, his personality was a lot like Frank's, really calm on actions. Didn't, he wasn't bothered by other service animals, wasn't bothered by the noise or anything like that. You rarely, heard Fraser bark. But when you took him off leash, um, when you took him off leash, oh, that was a happy dog running around and everything. And because when Frank was in Colorado Springs, obviously I got to be involved in some of that, caring of Fraser and all. But I'll never forget. This was my second national action. We were in St. Louis. And those of us who were arrested, we were taken to jail in St. Louis. And at that time, they were testing people for HIV. They weren't coming out telling us, but they were taking blood from us. And I remember, Frank tussling with them, about, the taking blood. They had some of us on the ground, with that. And they wouldn't tell us why they wanted our freaking blood, and Frank, that was it. I've always said Frank was a warrior, and you're right. He was fearless. There was nothing, that scared Frank, and so they have him on the ground, and I was just amazed at how calm Fraser was, doing all of that. Maybe he realized it was best to be calm, for his person, but I've seen them, and I went through that myself. Like Frank being tussled to the ground, being beat up by cops, and all that, and how he handled it, how he dealt with it. It was just, wow, and yeah, back then, a lot of the folks in the DAP did use wheelchairs, and I didn't use any mobility equipment back then. I just had my white cane, my tactile cane, and Frank and I, we were the two blind folks, and we'd be leading each other, around on actions. They have ADAPT has a structure, part of which the day leaders who plan the actions and who carry it out. And oftentimes Frank and I, the two blind folks was thrown together in day leader, and we just supported each other. Let me stop.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you so much. If would anyone else like to say anything about Frank?
Yeah, well, all I can say is we lost our leader because he has always been our leader here locally. But we understand, and he taught us it's because of him that people like myself, Michelle Robbins, that used to live here, and others came into ADAPT. I mean, from the beginning, Frank took us under his wing, and through tough lessons sometimes, but he taught us a lot about what we do, about what we know now in advocating with ADAPT and standing up for our rights. So I know that Desert ADAPT is mourning right now, and definitely we'll miss our leader, but we also want to continue his legacy. Like you all mentioned, he did a lot of work for our community, and we want to be able to continue that work and advocate for people with disabilities in our community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wanted to see if we could talk about employment. And I know that, just having worked with people with disabilities, I know my clients who are on what we call SSI, Supplemental Security Income, only receive about $738 a month, and Medicaid. And that's really what's most important to them, is the Medicaid, which pays for their health care. If they have housing expenses or medical expenses beyond what Medicaid pays for, they can get food stamps, usually around $120, $128, which is really not, like, the only way you can survive on that is if you're living with people and you're not living independently, or if you have a lot of other subsidies, like you live in subsidized housing, you use public transportation, etc. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to survive. So understandably, for that reason and many other reasons, people want to be employed, right? Employment brings dignity. It gives you something to do. It gives you purpose. And I wanted to see if y'all could talk to us about your different journeys. And we haven't heard a lot from Charles yet. So I wanted to see if he could talk to us about what it's like as someone who is deaf, what it's like to get employment in El Paso in particular, and what kind of barriers he still sees to this day.
Yeah, me as a deaf person.
So we're having a little bit of a difficulty hearing the interpreter. Could you raise your volume?
Yes, hold on.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You can hear the interpreter well?
Louder would be better.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I think, yes.
Okay, great. So myself as a deaf person, it's hard to obtain employment ever since high school. I remember applying at a car wash for employment. The person who interviewed me, he was like, I can't give you a job, you're deaf. And I was like, well, I tried to fight for that, but I was 14, maybe 13, 14 at the time. My parents taught me how to fight for myself, not depend on people, right? So I was basically depending on the stand to give me a job, but I was able to get my own truck, and I did lawn service for a while. I did yards, and I started my own business. And since high school, till college, that's what I've been doing. And I decided to get serious, and I became a teacher. I teach K through 4, and it's great. You know, but it is hard to find a job because not many people will hire me without an interpreter because they always want more. And so as an ASL teacher, I am able to do the job that I have, but same at the college, I've experienced it myself. I'm a deaf person, and I've applied 3 times, and I've never gotten interviewed to teach ASL classes. And so they've hired 3 other people than myself. So they just kind of exclude me that way as a deaf person. They typically just get the hearing person instead. They give them priority.
Wow. Has anyone else, go ahead. Has anyone else had similar experiences in terms of being passed up for employment because of disability?
I wonder if I could speak on that. I'll try to make this short because that's one of my emphasis is employment. When I worked at the Workforce Borderplex, I saw that there was a gap. There was a gap between the services and people with disabilities. And so I try to advocate through, at that time, for her name, she used to be the city manager, on blank.
Joyce Wilson?
There you go. Sorry about that. Joyce Wilson, to say, you know what, we have the services here at the workforce, like navigators and employers and whatnot, but the biggest barrier for people with disabilities now, mind you, we have the ADA, but it's the perception that people with disabilities cannot do the job. And for myself, anytime I have a chance, I will say where I work at, because to show that we can do it, no matter what our disabilities or our limitations. Like I say, people with disabilities don't have limitations, just potential. Myself, I've been fired twice for due to my disability. Once I had to go to court and I won. The second was negotiations. We came back to employment. And the thing is, I think that the biggest, like I said, the biggest gap is that perception, because you do want those people who employ people with disabilities to understand that we could do it. Mind you, when we assist with technology, like me, I need a screen reader since I am blind. And the thing is that once those employers understand that, and hopefully if you become mayor, Ms. Carvajal, you could kind of infuse that concept, because we tried it with Mayor Leeser, but before he left, he couldn't finish the task. because his term ended. But we're in the process where trying to incorporate the city into having some kind of what's called a job carving program. And until that happens, employment for people with disabilities right now in El Paso is like 80%. And the biggest, like I said, the percentage of that is because of perception. And we want to work. We want to be off SSI. We want to be off food stamp. Like you said, Ms. Carvajal, we want to have that dignity of paying for our own way. And thank God that I've been able to do that. But unfortunately, a lot of my brothers and sisters do not have that opportunity because it won't hire them. And to me, it's very frustrating because if you're on SSI, folks, and food stamps, you're living in poverty. I guarantee it. If you're independent living or living on your own, there's no way. There's no way you can support yourself. So fortunately, we have to live with other friends and our family because we can't make it on our own. And so I think, of course, the ADA is there to help us, but on our end, we need to educate the employers more to help us get more employed.
Can you give us some examples, any of the speakers, about some accommodations that employers have made for you?
This Anita. So I used to work for Anderson Windows, and Anderson Windows, they're like this high-end windows. And I did customer service, repairs, that nature. And so when I was hired, I asked that they, at that time, this was shortly after I was diagnosed with MS, so I was using a wheelchair. They put my desk on bricks so that I could slide my wheelchair under the desk. They had these service books that were like huge, real thick. And there was no way I could lift them by myself. So they broke them down into size for me. At that time, my seizures were very active. And so they would allow me to rest, after I had my seizures. But, I went back to school. I have a degree in biology from University of Illinois. And I went to medical school. This was in the 80s, pre-ADA, just before I joined ADAPT. They kicked me out because I began losing my eyesight and my seizures were becoming, uncontrolled. And rather than provide me with any supports, they told me to find another career path, which I guess was a blessing in disguise because I wound up getting a job at Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind, and that's how I got involved with ADAPT. But I went back to school to get my degree in computer information systems. I'm almost totally blind. At that time, I could build a computer from the ground up, and by hand from the ground up. I knew my mentor was a person who was blind, who owned his own computer shop and built his own computers, anything that he needed to see, soldering. He had sighted folks too. But when I tried to get hired, doing IT, things of that nature, and they'd see me in my wheelchair and they'd see me looking real close at things because I have low vision, they literally would laugh at me, laugh me out. It didn't matter to them, that, like I said, I had my degree. I could build a computer from the ground up, so much stuff I knew. But they took one look at me and decided, oh, you can't do this job. So speaking to what George was talking about, the perception that people with disabilities cannot do the work, and then I noticed that they started getting really, companies started getting really creative in how they would discriminate against you and would sometimes use the ADA to discriminate against you, because back then we didn't have the ADA Reconciliation Act, and so if back then, if you were someone who was legally blind and your vision could be corrected with glasses or contacts, you were not considered disabled. And so you were not that whole Lane versus Tennessee, was part of that. The unemployment among blind folks, oh my gosh, it's like extremely high. And that's the thing with some groups of people with disabilities. The unemployment rate is upwards of 70%, upwards of 80%, upwards of 90%. And then, I'm sorry, but y'all asked for me, and anybody that knows Anita knows I'm going to talk about it. You then throw in race and ethnicity, and then it really gets, it really gets bad. And then you try to figure out, is this an ADA discrimination? Is this a racial discrimination, or is it a combination of both? And in my experience, I experienced combination of both. And so when you look at the statistics for Blacks, and I can only speak to, because, I'm Afro-Latino, but my experiences as a Black woman, that the unemployment rate, among Black people with disabilities is astronomically high. And I would imagine that the same goes for Latinx community and Native American community, people with disabilities as well. So I'm going to stop it right there.
Thank you, Anita. Well, we've talked a little bit about employment, and George brought up the fact that if you're given the opportunity and some accommodations, you can excel, right? And you can be a good employee. What about going back a little bit more to your education? What accommodations existed when you went to school? And I know that people are from different age groups. So could you tell us what your education was like? And also, Christy, as a parent, what you've seen in terms of accommodations for children today in El Paso.
This is Anita. I went to school pre-ADA. Thankfully, when I started school back when children with disabilities had no right to an education. But I was mainstreamed from preschool through high school. When I was in about 5th grade, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act came in. It was under a different name back then, but that came into play. And so my teachers, there were so many bells and whistles and all. And so my teachers made sure that I had large print, that I had tutoring, all of that. But here's what happened to me. When you are considered gifted, and I was considered gifted, even though I was disabled, I then did not, once I got into high school, I didn't qualify for any services and supports because I was so-called gifted. And so in high school, I had to do it on my own. In college, I entered college at age 16. I went from a junior in high school to a junior in college at age 16. There were no services. I wasn't even allowed to take my classes. So I got along the best I could, obviously, I did very well, but, how much further, I would have gone had I had the services and supports. And as I said earlier, once I entered University of Illinois Medical School and my disabilities started coming into play and whatnot, rather than give me those services and supports, they asked me to, do another career choice. Now, when I went back in 1996, back in Denver, any accommodation I needed, I got, no questions asked. So I got books on tape, I got large print, I got, if there was one situation where my wheelchair was in the shop and I really couldn't come to school, they allowed me to do my work and email it to, my instructors, my professors, and so back then, and I think still because the ADA was relatively new, because I still hear issues of people with disabilities, and inaccessibility and whatnot on campus. Things were new. And I think that's with me. I had that, I was lucky enough that, when things happened, like when the idea came into play, I was new. And so everybody was excited about the bells and whistles and all. And then, going back to school post ADA, everybody was so excited about that, I got my college was totally accessible. We even had classes on accessible, accommodations and all of that, and how to use accessible software and whatnot to help us out on the syllabi. When each teacher presented their syllabus, on their syllabus, it stated, if you need accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, please let us know. So I was lucky then. I think now things are kind of, there are so many students who've been able to benefit, but I'm kind of seeing the cracks now. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. Josue, I think you were gonna say something.
Yeah, I think well, as far as accommodations, I know throughout. I'm not muted, right? Okay, I just thought I was muted again. I think that throughout school, that's what helped me do better and get better grades and help me graduate early. And when I started college, I think that that's what, getting the assistance that I needed, like the note taker, the extra time to take tests, all those accommodations, and having accessible classrooms all helped out during the process of going to school. Along with the workplace, I know that I had to have some accommodations done at one of my jobs when I applied for it, because it required testing, and it was a timed test. And with my vision, they didn't want to do any type of enlargement or allow me to use any assistive devices, so I had to advocate for that a bit. And at the end of the day, I got the job, but it took some advocating from myself and from people that wanted me at that job. So that helped.
When did you go to school and where did you go to school?
I graduated high school in 2000 from Baylor High School, and I got my associate's degree in early childhood education from El Paso Community College. And I did 2 years at UTEP, but I didn't finish my degree. I was gonna become a teacher, but then I got involved in a lot of other activities. Well, I got involved with ADAPT, I'll just say it, and then from there I just kept going with ADAPT, and here I am.
Great. And Charles, did you have your hand raised?
So yes, so for my education, I would say that I require an interpreter and a note taker. So the note taker and the interpreter was fine. My mother would require that I have a very skilled interpreter with good quality of interpreting skills. So, but in college, it was my responsibility. I was on my own. I struggled in college at UTEP.
Your video's frozen.
Some of them were terrible, and
or is it my computer?
So they were just they weren't evaluating or vetting the interpreters. They were like, oh, you know how to interpret? Okay, great. And it seems like that's still happening today. So they don't justify their skills. It took me 9 years to graduate from UTEP because I struggled with the interpreting services and all of that. And now I'm a graduate student at Gallaudet University, and it's so much different going from a hearing school to a deaf school compared to the time that I had at UTEP. It's a huge difference. So.
And do we have any, I think we have one university, in Texas for people who are blind and deaf?
Yes, so Southwest College for the Deaf. There's that one in Big Springs.
Mm.
And actually, that's an associate's college. It's not a bachelor's where you can obtain a bachelor's
I see.
university.
I see. Charles, when did you graduate from high school? What year? And what high school did you go to?
I graduated from 2004 from Burgess.
Oh, that's my school. That's my high school.
Oh, nice. What year did you graduate?
1994, way before you.
One second. I'm having a hard time hearing the audio on this end. 1 second, please.
They have to listen.
Okay, go ahead. I'm just having a hard time hearing the audio.
Okay. I don't know if George, you want to tell us about your, George, I'm not sure how long you've had visual impairment. Was that something that you were born with or that happened as you were growing up?
I've had low vision since I was young, but I guess my best acuity at one point was 20/40 in 2008. 2008, more or less, that's when it started going south. And then I want to say 2011, 12, that's más o menos, that's when it got to the point where I'm at now, where I just see like shadows. I graduated school before you there, Miss Carvajal, in 1990 from Sunset here in El Paso. I did go to UTEP. Actually, I went to community college for 2 years and then UTEP for a year and a half. And that's right before I got the job at the Department of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
So I left to Dallas. That was back in 2010, and never went back to school. I should have. People tell me I should close out my. I only have like 13, 14 hours left. But the ADA, the accommodations I got were great. I got taped courses. I had note takers. I had, of course, extra time for courses. And so, I think without the ADA, I would not have advanced so much in school. Now, granted, I should have finished it. And also, I'm not sure for I don't know if it's still now exists, but I know when I was going back then, school was free for us. I guess, I don't know for blind users, but I'm not sure for anyone else, but they would give us a voucher for school, for books, even for the housing. And they'll stick to the state of Texas. So the ADA did help me a lot. Yes, ma'am, it did. Now, how the schools implemented it, the accommodation is totally different because honestly, in my opinion, I think El Paso Community College, well, in my experience back then, it was a lot more advanced than UTEP. So I'm not sure if it's changed or not. Of course, that's been some years. But like I said, without those accommodations, I would not have progressed as much as I did. There's no way.
Yeah. Christy?
Sorry, we're having issues hearing the audio. It's very, very faint. Can you let me back into the meeting? I'm trying to access it. For some reason, I'm not able to access. Sorry to interrupt.
Let me see. Gracie, so you have Tamara, the second account? Let me see if Gracie, I'm no longer the host. And so I think Gracie will have to let you in if you're in the waiting room. Okay. Are you back in? No. Here we go. You're back in?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gracie.
Okay.
Christy, can you tell us about your experiences with the education system in El Paso, and if you've had other experiences in other cities or states, anything that you see that could be improved on?
Well, my kids, we started off in California, and my 3 younger kids were all within the umbrella of special ed because they all qualified for speech services. We started off with Isleta. Actually, no, we started off with El Paso Independent School District, And then, because we were renting at that time, we just moved to El Paso. We ended up going to Isleta and then ended up back in El Paso when we moved to the west side. I found that I think Isleta was better with their special ed. They had a lot of parent education opportunities, more so than EPISD did. They had it a little more together with that. They even had music therapy, which EPISD did not have. However, I did have challenges with MacArthur. My daughter had gone to the PPCD program at MacArthur, and so it wasn't a really good experience, but we kind of hung in there. And so what happened was when we went to Zach White, I had a great experience because we had a wonderful principal. It was Dr. Michael Warmack, who happened to have a special ed background. So he was very inclusive. They did everything to accommodate my then kindergartner and first grader who is on the autism spectrum. And at that time, we didn't have a formal diagnosis, but she was also in the GT program at the school. But at that time, I'd already started, I was homeschooling my oldest one who was in high school. And I just found that I had better opportunities for my kids through homeschooling because of special ed. The school provides you with speech therapy, but the speech therapy is like a half an hour with like 8 kids. So it's essentially maybe like the equivalent of 10 minutes of special ed, of speech. And the problem with that is that because when they take them out for speech, then they're missing class time. So then they have to make up that stuff that they missed during class time. So and also, as much as you can do an IEP and you can accommodate things, you can't accommodate the kids. And the kids notice that that the child is out of the classroom, and why are they out of the classroom? Why do they have these accommodations? So for us, our decision was to homeschool because I wanted my daughter to just be able to learn and just be herself and not have to worry about the social aspects of it. In addition to that, we have the ability to do socializing through the homeschool co-ops and things like that. But I have still been in contact with some of my friends that are board members of the school, schools, just to kind of advocate for those other kids, because I know that homeschooling is not really for everybody. And I think that if you want to do it and do it effectively, you have to really love what you're doing. And for me, it was easier to do that because I was finding myself every year looking to see who was the best option for the teacher for the next year. My daughter's kindergarten teacher, the teachers really need to have special ed, a little bit of training on developmental stuff, milestones, signs for autism, signs for ADHD, maybe things that they could see as red flags. My daughter in kindergarten would hum in class. And so that's actually a sign. It's stimming for kids on the spectrum. And the teacher would complain and say that she was humming and singing in class because she wanted to annoy the other kids. So it's always the assumption that they're doing it on purpose or they're doing certain things. So I think in that case, education goes a long way. And the problem is, I had contacted the principal recently because I was trying to get a stipend to go to a conference through the school district, because I have the disadvantage that I pay the property taxes for the schools. And so when they have these events at Region 19 and stuff, the schools sometimes pay for the parents to go to these educational things. Well, I don't have a home school. So, no one's going to offer to cover that for me. And to put out about $300 for something at Christmas time or at other time, it's kind of frustrating because, I know that my property taxes are paying for that. Now I'm not using all the school things, but I'm just like, I just want this one conference, so that's a challenge for me, but I have no regrets in regard to homeschooling. And, but I do think that the schools, they do need to, I go to a lot of conferences where I see some teachers and it's great. And then there's some teachers that I know that have been told that they can't get the time off to go. or they don't let them go. And I think if a teacher is willing to go and educate themselves that little bit of extra to kind of work with it, it would make all the difference in the world, because, you know, there's so many kids out there that have ADHD, and having just that little bit of insight on how to help them focus better will probably make the teacher's job a hell of a lot better. So that's, but ultimately, I mean, the school we went to was a good school. I just felt that my kids had a better chance by homeschooling.
Is there anyone else who wants to talk about education? I think we've covered everyone. In terms of accessibility, right? One of the things that was raised many years ago by Volar, which is our independent living center, they had a conference and it was called I think it was visitability. So the ability to visit people and spaces, right? That was like sort of the messaging that when you are, especially if you have physical impairments, you're often trapped inside your home, and hopefully the home is accessible itself. And so if you want to have freedom and visit people and go to public spaces, you need some accommodations. And so the most common one, I think, is the ramps inside, that make buildings that are not leveled when you walk into them accessible to wheelchairs or people who use walkers. That has been, I mean, it's a long battle, and it's by no means over. What other issues do you still see in El Paso when it comes to accessibility and when it comes to services? And Anita, I know you're not in El Paso, but I know that you, I'm sure, are still running into things that are a problem and a challenge physically. Josue, do you want to tell us?
Well, I think one of the things that we run into a lot, and other people may beg to differ, is the lack of accessible, affordable, and integrated housing. That's one of the biggest issues we have. I know that we had a long struggle.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Can you define integrated and why that's important?
That it's not separate housing just for people with disabilities or by type of disability, and it's important because of inclusion. People with disabilities should be included into all aspects of community life. That's what we fight for. So yeah, that's the thing that we believe in, that people with disabilities should not be segregated into silo housing just based on diagnosis or disability. Yeah, and like I was mentioning, that's one of the fights that we had a couple of years ago, where they unfortunately lowered the number of required accessible units. And one of the things that we find, and I can tell you this because I've been helping a couple of people look for apartments, and everywhere that you call, they are either occupied, or they're occupied by somebody that needs them, or somebody that doesn't need the accommodations, but they can't just let go of the apartment, right? So it's difficult for people to actually be able to find accessible, affordable housing, especially integrated. So yeah, that's one of the biggest issues I think that we have in our community, is the lack of accessible housing. I know that there are several complexes that have been built, but some of those don't take into consideration the connectivity to the city services, especially the bus routes. So that's a big issue as well.
So you're referring to I think it was also back in when Joyce Wilson was the city manager, and there was a lot of back and forth about whether new construction had to have a certain number of units that had different levels of accessibility. And builders said they're more expensive to build and no one wants them. And so why do we have to have these high numbers? To them, it was high numbers of accessible units. But we've talked about this before, George, and I know Christy, that when a space is made accessible to someone with disability, it does not become inaccessible to someone who doesn't have the disability. And
Mhm.
so I can use a bathroom that's accessible, even though I'm not in a wheelchair. It doesn't keep me from using it. But it also means that someone else who is physically impaired can use it. And uh, and I think that there are challenges to be made in terms of the Fair Housing Act and a landlord's obligation to really try to make the accommodation. So that would be approaching the tenant that's living in the accessible unit and saying, can I move you to a second floor because there's someone here? And this is a serious issue. I know people who have had to crawl upstairs on a regular basis to get to their unit because they became impaired, either physically, sometimes mentally. Sometimes anxiety gets so intense that people are not able it becomes a physical manifestation. And so they're not able to walk the way that they used to. People who have been through severe trauma sometimes go through this. And so, no one should have to crawl literally upstairs to get to their home. But that happens when you don't have enough units. And as we were saying before, affordability is a big issue for many El Pasoans, but especially if you have a disability and you're living on disability benefits, or you're working but you have really expensive healthcare because of your disability, and that eats into what you can afford to pay for your housing. So they're all related. In terms of advocacy, locally, I know that the Paso Norte Civil Rights Project used to bring lawsuits. I don't know if y'all remember, every year they used to bring lawsuits around this time, and they would target different businesses that were refusing to make their spaces accessible. The Civil Rights Project locally shut down a few years ago. And to my knowledge, there isn't anyone who has taken that up, as well as they were able to do that at all.
I know back then, Jared Unterrecker, the legal director,
Mhm.
he actually helped me sue one of my former employees. And that, that's what lacks here in El Paso, Ms. Carvajal, is a lot of the resources other metropolitans have, we don't. For example, there's not one singular entity that right now that can take on those challenges of suing for ADA access. And I think that's one of the problems here in El Paso, is that we're so out here, people think that we're part of New Mexico sometimes, And but I do want to say one thing: we have to keep in mind that when it comes to access, it's not always structural. It's sometimes print materials. For like myself, is that, or those who are visually impaired, if having access to simple stuff, for example, menus, um, websites. And I know the city, we had done, me and Mr. Josue, when he was on the advisory committee, we went through the whole process of doing a new transition plan for El Paso, the city of El Paso, and one of the components was websites to make sure that those components were accessible. And I think that's what a lot of times that's what's missed, especially like restaurants. I want to say 90% of restaurants here in El Paso don't have a large print or electrical or electronic menu. So many times I have to ask my wife or the waiter or whatnot. But I think if we want to be more inclusive, we have to be more, not aggressive, but more proactive when it comes to advocating. Like you just said right now, Ms. Carvajal, advocating. It's very essential that people participate. I have a saying that says no participation, no progress. And a lot of things that could happen don't happen because ourselves are not very active when it comes to advocacy. I have to give my hat off to Josue. This man, he spent, I think, was it, Christy, a week in front of the Republican party here in El Paso due to some kind of a restriction on Medicaid. And many people in Desert Ave stood out there for a week, 24 hours. We even told Josue, you better go home, man. You're getting sick out here. But the point is, what I'm trying to say is that we need to be more active when it comes to advocating here in El Paso.
Yeah. Thank you. Tell us about that, Jose. Oh, your video is gone. Can you tell us about what you were challenging and what you did? No, Josue's video is gone. Christy, can you give us some details while Josue comes back?
Well, a lot of the people from ADAPT were outside the Republican office on the west side. by the gym. They were outside protesting the cuts to Medicaid. And so it was a really crazy thing because they were on the end of the cul-de-sac. And it started off with them on the end of the cul-de-sac, and then the Islamic Center was really kind, and they donated some tents for them because everyone was camped out there. And so then they had tents. I'm not tents, like the coverings, like like you would go like to a soccer game to have those coverings. And then of course they had tents also. And then there was the issue of they had power chairs, and so having to charge up the power chairs. And so they were going to the gym to charge up their power chairs. But then the Republican Party had people complain that they didn't want to see that they had all these disabled people there that looked like they were falling asleep by the gym, and they were disturbed by it. And so then all of a sudden they weren't going to let them charge up their power chairs there. So I went into the Islamic Center and spoke to them, and they were very kind. And they said as long as they were open, they could come in and charge their chairs there. And so I was going almost every day. There's many of us going, bringing food, bringing water, making sure everybody's okay, hanging out for a while and chatting. And it was actually it was a great experience, but, in the sense that there was a lot of solidarity, from other people in the community for them. And I didn't even know that the wheelchairs could, I think Josue's wheelchair comes up and it reclines. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know I did that. And actually at that time, while I was hanging out with them, I had just gotten the diagnosis for my daughter, Vivi, my youngest. The doctor had told me that she had cerebral palsy. And it was almost like a kismet moment, because I think that if I had gotten that diagnosis at any other time, I might've been a little worried or freaked out, or as a parent, and in reality, to me, it was just another label, because here I was hanging out with all these people. And I remember my friend Joanne Cross, she says to me, you know how to find out more about cerebral palsy? And I said, no, how? Tell me. She's like, ask an adult with cerebral palsy. I mean, that was like so obvious. And that's what I really started to learn with advocacy, that there's a wealth of knowledge in learning from actual adults with disabilities. So often as parents, we look to the doctors and to the therapists. And even though the therapists and doctors treat people with disabilities, they don't actually have it. They don't know what it's like to live with it. They don't know what it's like to sometimes to have a child with it, but usually, not always. I mean, there's always some. So it was a really, that whole experience, it kind of like opened up my whole world for me, as a parent. And I didn't feel afraid. I knew that my kids were going to be okay, because here are these people who, live their lives and have, lives of their own, are independent and productive and badass, and knowing that I knew at that point that my daughter was going to be okay. I didn't have to worry about that. And we see so many times, I think parents groups, they infantize people with disabilities. They see them as kids, or like, oh, wow, you did this, or did you pick out your own outfit? Or I've actually heard people say this to adults, or you see like an adult that's dressed more like childlike. And the reality is that that people with disabilities can do pretty much anything with an accommodation. And so we really need to just respect people as individuals and embrace the differences.
Thank
So
you.
sorry, I went a little too.
That was great. Well, Anita and Charles, what do you think about, what did your parents do right? You're both very independent. You're both very involved and very helpful to other people with disabilities. Does that reflect on what your parents did in terms of what Christy was talking about, and not reducing you to a child up well into your adulthood?
Yeah, this is CJ. For me, can you hear me?
There's a little bit of feedback, but Maybe a little bit louder.
Okay, so for me, fortunately, my parents, my family signs at home, and since I was a child, I've been
I
able to
think
have communication at home.
the audio might be a little bit off. Can we try again?
I think they're.
Okay, better?
Yes. Yes, much better.
Okay, so should I repeat myself?
Yes, please.
Okay, so for me personally, fortunately, I had communication at home. 100% or 90% of people, deaf children, are born into hearing families, and 30% of people learn sign language for those people that are deaf, but 70% of the families don't communicate with their deaf children at home. So that taught me independence. That taught me hard work, and I didn't have to depend on people because I knew that I could depend on my mom, and I did depend on my mom, and she worked. And then I would tell her that I wanted this and this and this
For
if we went to McDonald's, and my mom was like, "Well, you go, you order it yourself." And I was like, and I would get angry, and I would throw a tantrum. But she was like, "Well, what are you going to do if I'm gone?" And I was like, and that stuck with me. And so I would have to order myself. And that's how I learned from a very young age.
That's
Another
great.
question.
No, I think that's great. I hope parents are listening.
Just a second here. Who's going to say something else real quick? For me as a deaf person, and people seeing me and saying that I can't do things, it's not a thing, because the only thing I can't do is hear. People keep saying you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't drive, you can't have a family, you can't have a job. But what does that have to do with my hearing? I can do many other things, just not hear.
That's great.
Charles, tell them about when you wanted to go zip lining, that whole thing that you had to deal with.
I'm very good with English and writing everything down, writing back and forth. I can do that, it's great. And so a lot of people showed up and they started talking, and they didn't include me in the conversation. And we're all adults, but they just kept ignoring me. And so I was like, kept writing to them, what's going on? What's going on? And, they were having their own conversation. I'm deaf. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what that conversation was. They're like, you know what? You're deaf. You can't do the zip line. And so they called the cops and they kicked me out. I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea why. And they just told me, you're deaf, you got to go. So a week later, I was informed that they thought that it was a concern because I was deaf, and as a deaf writer.
I didn't know English.
And that I didn't know English. And so they kicked me out.
Wow. What happened after that? Did you complain?
So yeah, we went through a process, and we ended up just dropping it. But I ended up going ziplining in Mexico, so I had my fun.
Anita, I don't know if you can speak to this, or maybe the three of you that are left. Have you found people speaking through you? Do you find yourself at times that you're invisible, the way that Charles has described, where people don't even acknowledge your existence, and they talk, like I said, through you or over you to someone else?
Oh goodness, yes. Growing up, I have a twin sister who is non-disabled. We were treated differently. My parents literally had no expectations of me. But what they did do is that they insisted that I do everything my twin did. Whatever she did, if she had to wash dishes, that meant I had to wash dishes. And And if she did the laundry, chores, all, I had to do that as well. And that was good for me because it showed me that even though I was blind, as a child, I had seizures. I was autistic, but back during those times, they weren't diagnosing Black children, particularly Black girls, with autism. So I got my diagnosis as an adult. But remember, I was one of these quote unquote gifted children. And so I read quite a bit at high school. At 5 years old, I was reading at college level. So I was the bane of existence of teachers anyway. And they figured out, I think my teachers had far more hope in me than my parents. But my parents teaching me to do everything my non-disabled sister could do told me that if I put my mind to it and figured out a way, and with services and supports, I could do it. Now, when I just had my white cane, I was able to pass, and I was independent, enough that I worked for. I worked for Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind. I trained blind people in technique, cane technique, and stuff like that. And so I was able, for safety reasons, to get around without, the cane most of the time. And so a lot of times I passed, and until people saw me trying to look at stuff, they didn't know. And then I got the whole, do you need a do you need a magnifying glass? Do you need glasses? Things of that nature. When I started using the wheelchair is when I really started being erased. That people would stand over. I'll tell you a story. I was with my mom, and I had left my wheelchair in the van, and I was hobbling around on my cane in the store. And I went to pay for my groceries and things, and and my cane was unseen, and the cashier and I was having a wonderful conversation. And then and I paid with my credit card, and she gave me the thing to sign, and I had to look real close. She turns to my mom and says, "Tell her." And then I stopped her. I said, "Look, we were having a wonderful conversation. I was fine. Now all of a sudden, I'm disabled. Now you're going to not talk to me? What's up with that?" And I got that so many times of people ignoring me and everything like that, that I just started getting, people tell me that I'm angry and all of that, and I'm loudmouthed. And I had to be, because I would stop them in their tracks and say, no, speak to me. Don't talk to them. I get to the point where I don't have my wife go out with me. Because if she does, even to this day, people will try to talk to her rather than me. And interestingly enough, my wife is deaf. And so, but they would try to talk to her because she didn't look disabled, or she didn't have, even though she's got hearing aids, and so they would try to talk to anybody who didn't appear to be disabled rather than talk to me. And I just stop it. I stop it in its tracks. And that's what you have to do. You can't be afraid of people and what they're going to say to, say, hey, you stop this right now. You will not erase me. I am here. I am not invisible, and you will deal with me and me alone. So that's been my experience.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions from people who are hearing impaired. So I'm going to turn to Charles for this. So Frankie Alvidres has said, I am hearing impaired and want to help. If it wasn't for the Volar program, I would have never been able to afford my hearing aids. Who can I contact to assist or get involved locally? Charles, who would you recommend? And I think another question also came in earlier about this.
Okay, so for hearing aids, I am not the expert, but I can contact I could suggest to contact the Texas Workforce Commissions, and they'll be able to assist with hearing aids. So if it's for work purposes, they can definitely help with that, with the hearing aids.
And in terms of, let me see, we had another question earlier. So this person said, hello, I am deaf. I'm a deaf person who is dealing with an ADA accessibility issue. I have tried to reach out to Inclusive El Paso and a few other people regarding this issue and have not gotten any response. I really need some advice in regards to filing an ADA complaint to a doctor's office who refuses to provide an interpreter for my appointment. Can someone please help me out? I need help finding an advocacy group or organization as well. Is that an issue that you all see in regards to people trying to access medical assistance?
Yes, so for me personally, that is an issue I encounter often as far as appointments for medical or dental, whatever it may be. For some reason, they resist to provide the interpreting services. Sometimes they do, but those that don't want to provide an interpreter, we have to go up to the supervisor, and then we have to go ahead and go to the ADA compliance officer, and then tell them we're going to file a complaint. And they're like, no, I don't want to deal with that person. And then the accommodation, when we give that word out, it seems that they kind of budge to give services. So for as far as a doctor's appointment, sometimes they'll forget to call the interpreter, and they're like, you know what, you're gonna have to come back tomorrow or the next day. And I'm like, I took a day off to do this, so get the interpreter and tell them to come. And that's an issue that's happening often. But as far as ADA compliance, the ADA compliance office, suggesting that to tell them and contacting maybe the interpreting agency, and maybe they can give more information or contact that office themselves as well.
I know one of my clients said when he went to the emergency room at one of the local hospitals, he was given an interpreter by, I guess, like a tele-interpreter. So it was remotely done.
Interpreting, VRI, and that's a video remote interpreter. I personally have not experienced that. I have experienced Purple Video Relay Service or through telecommunication, but not a actual interpreter on a video screen, because not all interpreters have the expertise to interpret medical situations, and to rely on the connection, you don't know if, I don't think that that's really reliable or dependable, because the video quality can not be good, and then the communication is bad. I prefer to have an interpreter in person that's familiar with the vocabulary of medical terms. And when you do VRI, video remote interpreting, you have no idea who you're going to get on the screen or what their style of communication is. Is it going to match your sign language mode of communication? Mm-hmm. You won't know until you get the person, and not every deaf person signs the same either. So
Charles, do you have a list of resources of any doctors in El Paso that may be ASL friendly, so that if people are looking for a doctor where they don't have to worry about that, they can look for that?
I actually, go ahead. I actually need to make a list that would be a deaf-friendly, accessible for doctors or dentist office, anything like that. I need to make a list of that.
When you get that, I'd love to get a copy of that, because I think a lot of times parents are looking for that as well. And also with volunteering at the Borderland Rainbow Center, we do have a lot of deaf clients. And so I think that would be very helpful, a helpful resource to have on hand. So that I know that like the LGBTQ plus center, they have like the purple pages. So it's almost like we need a disability friendly network of providers, so that we could know that, okay, this person is aware. You know, obviously they do need to be ADA compliant, but it's like, why jump through the hoops looking for people when you have some that are available?
I'm back, and I do apologize.
Right.
Thank you, George.
I guess I'm having a problem with my Wi-Fi, so I had to like literally jump off the Wi-Fi and use my phone.
Thank you for jumping back in.
Did Josue jump back in?
Not yet.
I think we're having, because we live in the same area, so it might be something with spectrum.
Okay. Well, let's, we've talked a little bit about organizing as we were talking about Frank Lozano and the work that Anita has done, and the work that y'all have done. What do you think, where is organizing around disability rights in El Paso right now? What issues are you most concerned about, and how would you like to see them addressed? We just talked briefly about, when was the protest in front of the Republican headquarters in El Paso, Christy? Do you remember the year?
I think it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't know. George, do you know?
Yeah, I think it was like 3 years ago.
And that was in response to cuts by the state to Medicaid, right? So if I remember correctly, the state was cutting back on people's abilities to use healthcare providers. So that was one issue. And so healthcare providers are very important for people with physical disabilities.
And therapies.
And
they were trying
therapies.
to cuts to therapies.
And I think also to children's Medicaid.
Right, children's Medicaid for sure.
And so when you have less provider hours, that means that someone else has to take care of you, or you go without the service, which can be very dangerous for people.
Yeah. Like my mother, for example, to kind of piggyback what you said, Ms. Carvajal, my mother, before she passed away, she couldn't walk. So, she had very limited hours of personal care attendant.
Mm-hmm.
We're provided, I think, 12 hours, 14 hours for the whole week. So me and my wife would take over what was in the gap. But that's another thing that I don't know if we mentioned it yet, but the support services, not only, the vocational and whatnot, but the family integration, where the family steps in to help that person be more independent, to leave out, to live out there in the communities, to work or to school. Because someone in the wheelchair that has a severe disability where they can't walk, like my mom, she's gonna just simply just jump in their car or, just go to a movie. She had to plan it out. Excuse me. She had to plan it out where to go to somewhere. It had to be a process. It's not simple as just get in the car and just go. And where the ADA has helped in that, has provided a lot of these services, paratransit, like the Lyft and the other vehicle services that are available. And that's one of the things I think we need to talk about. I don't know if we spoke on that, on transportation regarding here in El Paso. Ms. Carvajal, just to let you know, if you do become mayor of El Paso, hopefully you do, that one of the issues that's really happened a lot, or is happening a lot, is not funding enough vehicles, or let me rephrase that, not funding enough money or allocating money for new vehicles for the paratransit. The paratransit has over 100 vehicles right now. Mass majority of those vehicles are outdated. They need high maintenance, which is cost to the city, even though it's a private contract. But I think we need to really focus, when you said organizing, to really focus on the use of money here in El Paso that the city has control of to help us, people, be more independent. The LIFT really stands for Living Independently Facilitated by Transportation. But if those vehicles are breaking down half the time, we can't get to work on time or get to our doctor appointment. That really impacts people with disabilities. So I think that's one thing that really needs to be looked at, the funding of paratransit here in El Paso.
And those services are really invaluable to people who, the children or the caregivers of people with disabilities, because that means that you have to take time off from work to take that person to the doctor, because the lift is not available. So I think it's a very crucial service. Jose, you joined us by phone.
Yeah, I'm by phone right now. And just picking, I think you're talking about transportation. That's what I got the gist of. Well, I think it is important to have paratransit as an option, but I think even more important is to have a reliable fixed route system with connectivity. That provides a lot more independence and is a lot cheaper than using the paratransit.
because the paratransit, there is some cost related to it. But if we had a system a reliable transportation system where everything is connected, where everything is accessible, then people would not have to rely so much on the already saturated paratransit systems that we have.
And not only that, Ms. Josue, don't forget. Remember, we're on the committee when they did the HDA transition plan. There were at that time over 500 bus stops here in El Paso that were not accessible. That the city did 500 bus stops. So what Mr. Josue is saying about connectivity is true. You can have all these bus, all this fixed route going into especially like East El Paso, the Far East. But if you don't have an accessible bus stops, it doesn't really, someone with a mobility device is useless.
That is true.
That makes a lot of sense. Did COVID present special challenges for people with disabilities?
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. Did somebody respond to it?
No.
Logging back in. So the question was, did COVID bring about issues in transportation for people with disabilities?
Yes, in terms of transportation.
Yes, I think initially it did, especially when there were a lot of different considerations that the city was taking that would have most likely jeopardized our independence and our flexibility. But thank God that we have a community here of advocates that quickly organizes ourselves and is in touch with our city, our ADA coordinator specifically, to make sure that services aren't jeopardized, because they were talking about doing some restrictions on who could ride the public transit and who could use the paratransit. And a couple of us got together and we addressed that issue quickly, that services should be provided for people who need them. I do know that they did expand services during the COVID period for people with disabilities that weren't typical Lyft riders, and that's something that came about through our coalition effort that we did initially when this started.
And another issue that came up also, Jose, I remember, an issue that when the pandemic first came out and they had the drive-through testing, there was no mechanism for someone that uses a mobility device, or for myself who is blind, to self transport themselves to that drive-through testing center. And we reached out to the city, the county, and everybody's like, well, I think they're doing it. So like Mr. Josue, a coalition of us came together and kind of negotiated with the city, say, okay, there has to be something, and kind of make a mechanism that will allow someone with a disability that has a transportation barrier to get to those bus stops. I'm sorry, those drive-through centers. And thankfully there is something in place for that. But that's one of the things I think is not really, that was an oversight, because everything was, this is a kind of new pandemic or new way of life, so to speak. But thank God that now there is. And that's what I'm saying about organizing and advocating. We need to be more aggressive when it comes to especially crucial stuff like that, and when it affects people with disabilities.
Yes.
And I think, George, you and Charles were featured on a TV spot about this, right? When COVID first came out, there were issues with communication. Can you tell us about that?
I don't know if Charles wants to speak on that, because that's something that was my attention.
I think I know that a lot of time has passed, but in the very beginning of the pandemic, the mayor and the county judge were having press conferences that were pretty informal, and they were in a room, and there were some issues. Is it now? Are you remembering now?
Yeah, what happened is the initial press conferences that was being done, there were no interpreter, not zero. And so, the concern, and the point is that, I don't know if people know this, Ms. Carvajal, but the city manager is a former ADA coordinator. He used to be one in Lubbock. So when we reached out to him to say, okay, why are you having a conference with no interpretation, no deaf and hard interpretation? He said, well, Mr. Zavala, no, it was an oversight. And I'm like, well, that's not an excuse. Because number one, it's the law. And number two, you know better. You used to be a coordinator in Lubbock, so there's no excuse for that. So I'm not sure if it's still doing it now, because again, when it comes to interpretation, I can't see that. But another thing that was popping up were social media posts done by the city and or city representatives that were not accessible for those who are blind. Now that did take some work with the coordinator, Mr. Julio Perez. And a lot of the stuff that was being posted initially was, for example, drive-through location, or where to go to if you have symptoms, crucial information that was not accessible for those who are blind or visually impaired. And that has been worked on, thank God. I know there's some gaps in there sometimes, but at least that's being addressed. I want to say maybe 75% of the time.
Well, and Julio, I'm sorry to jump in, this is Christy. Julio is being spread thin right now because they had someone that left from Sun Metro. So they're having him do the Sun Metro thing and the ADA thing. Mm-hmm. And I know that I've messaged with CJ about this, but the social media for the city is just disgraceful. I mean, the only rep right now that's actually more accessible right now is Henry Rivera at this point. A lot of the times things are posted from the city, and not only at the library isn't accessible, the police department is not accessible. They posted one time about there was a guy that had assaulted people or something, and to look out for him, and they posted a PDF. Not a PDF, I'm sorry. They posted a GIF with the information for it. And so I actually commented on there saying, would you mind posting a link? I mean, it's really not rocket science for the image things. I mean, you could look at something, and for example, the city had a thing where they were showing all the essential workers. So they had a fireman, and he had a sign on it, and the sign said, you stay home for us. We go to work for you. You stay home for us. It was something like that. And so we were telling them, you need to put image descriptions. So it was so they said, oh, okay. So they posted the picture of, say, the fireman with a sign, and the image description was first responder smiling. They missed the mark. The guy's holding a sign that has a message, but you're just saying he's smiling. And so it's very frustrating. I mean, because I've actually gotten to the point now where I'm commenting whenever I see them. And then, of course, then you get the community where I posted something like, hey, would you mind describing that so that someone who is visually impaired can see? It was the mayor posts inaccessible things all the time. He posted, it was the star on the mountain with a little mask on it. And so I said, would you mind describing the picture so that people who are visually impaired will know what it is? And some lady responded and said, it's just the star with a mask on it. It's not much to see. Well, I appreciate that you think that, but how about you describe it so that the person who's visually impaired can make that decision for themselves, whether or not that's worth knowing. That's what inclusion, that's what accessibility is about. So they missed the point. And I feel like they need a little more awareness. And I know that the ADA coordinator says that everybody that works for the city has had some kind of training. So I don't know. It is very frustrating.
Ms. Carvajal, if I could mention this real fast, and I didn't mention it earlier. Last year, November of last year, there was a survey done by a nonprofit out of, I think it was New Hampshire. They did an evaluation of 180 metropolitan cities on accessibility when it comes to education, transportation, economics, and housing. 180. And where did you think El Paso fell?
I'm not sure. Tell us.
146.
Oh my gosh.
Now, one of the things I think is attributes to that is leadership. And what I mean by that is under Oscar Leeser and John Cook, we would meet with him, and I say we, all of us, would meet with the mayor once every quarter. This mayor that took over, and I'm not trying to be negative, I just want to give my experience as to why the contributing factors for that 146, in my opinion, is that the mayor, when Margot took over, we asked the same thing. Are you willing to meet with us every quarter to address our issues? Because it helped. It helped a lot. I think Christy and Josue and Charles can admit, working with Oscar Leeser, it helped meeting every quarter to address our issues. And the mayor said no, he won't do that, and he hasn't done that.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. In my experience as someone who's just worked on these issues with clients with disabilities and has looked at the law, I know that people with disabilities are often an afterthought, right? So people do their policies, even the law, like the Fair Housing Act that I love so much. In 1964, it didn't include people with disabilities. It covered different protected classes, but disabilities was not included until 1968. So again, you have an example of people or different abilities just not being thought of from the very beginning. And so this can have deadly consequences. Some of it is an inconvenience, some of it is really dangerous, especially when we're talking about the pandemic. And so I really appreciate the advocacy that all of you have done to ensure that you and other people are able to access this information, because it is very important for people to understand how to limit their exposure, where they can get tested, how to access different services right now. And so I want to thank all of you for your advocacy. We don't have any law firm that's dedicated to these kinds of cases, unfortunately, anymore. Legal Aid does some of this work, but it's obviously not enough. And so I think that's something that's really lacking in our community, because I think that our ranking would change if businesses and government entities were forced to do this. You can encourage someone to do it, but sometimes they need enforcement to actually get it done.
I do have one thing I'd like to mention, if that's okay. I think that we need to have some kind of an advisor to the Office of Emergency Management. Quite often during emergencies, people with disabilities are the first people to die because of these things. In regard to the food banks are pretty much inaccessible. If you don't have transportation, if you're a disabled person without a car, it's very difficult to get that. If you're riding the bus, you're getting these big boxes of several things. The BRC has been a wonderful resource, the Borderland Rainbow Center, where I volunteer. We got permission from the board to make deliveries. We are helping over 400 families every week. And I personally go and I deliver to people that are disabled or immune compromised and elderly. We had an elderly lady that I take things to that was walking like 8 blocks to come to the BRC with her little cart to come get her food, or another lady that takes the bus. These are people that are at a high risk, and it's too risky for them to go to the store. It's risky for them to take the bus. I have a gentleman that's an amputee that I take things to. There were times where we didn't have toilet paper, we didn't have certain things, and I try to help the clients that I take to, but it's a complete fail on the part of emergency management to not have a plan in place for people who are disabled and take public transportation to have access to food. And the food bank does take money. I think the city has donated. So, I know they put a pilot where they were going to deliver food to people, but then it was like on case by case and certain things. But it's not enough. It's a total fail. And there are so many people that need that right now. There are just too many people in need. And it's just completely unacceptable that has been missed.
Thank you, Christy. That's a
This
great.
Anita, I wanted to say something. it's more of a national thing, but we're seeing it, and I'm going to reference a case that actually happened in Texas. So what COVID has laid bare is racial disparities in healthcare, particularly among Blacks, particularly among Latinx, particularly among Indigenous folks. Those are the three big communities that we have been failed by COVID stuff. Now, bad enough that often people with disabilities can't get access a lot of times to COVID testing. But we need to be careful that doctors aren't making decisions about treatment based on your disability or your perceived quality of life. We are seeing a number of cases where, people call it medical rationing, where they decide not to treat you, whether it's for COVID or something else, specifically due to your disability, specifically because they have decided that because you're disabled, you have no quality of life. That is dangerous and it's killing people. And we need to be aware of that and be on the lookout for that. If it happened in Austin, I'm pretty sure it can and is happening in El Paso.
So a little bit of background. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that case, unless you want me to give a summary. But it was at a hospital in Austin, Texas, where a man with disability was denied, I believe, a ventilator because the doctor very pointedly told his wife, he's probably not going to survive anyway. And so we need to prioritize this for someone who has a better chance of surviving. And she said, well, it doesn't matter. You have to try. Why is his life worth less? He has quality of life, and why is he being denied this? If you have the service, give it to him. And they said, well, just in case someone else who has a better quality of life in our eyes comes along, we want to say that. And so what Anita was saying was that when you're rationing resources, you should not, well, first of all, you shouldn't ration resources and exclude people with disabilities because you're assuming that their life is worth less because they have a disability.
And this, Anita, what the doctor actually told her, because she said, well, is it because my husband can't walk that you're not going to treat him? He said, yeah, he really doesn't have any quality of life. And that doctor went on to say that he would do that even to his own family members. And so, and what was happening was, he was denied treatment for COVID-19, which he contracted in a nursing home. And so we're seeing that happen a lot. COVID, it's been happening all the time. Mr. Hickson also fell under Texas's futility laws, which are the worst in the nation, the most draconian. And so, COVID is laying it bare, but there are lots of doctors out there who are denying people with disabilities treatment specifically because they are disabled. And specifically, they're saying that because you're disabled, you have no quality of life. You can't do things. And this doctor based it on the fact that he couldn't walk. So we definitely have to, be aware of that and watch out for that, because especially as things get worse, and unfortunately it's going to get worse before it gets better, we're going to run into those situations where doctors are making decisions based on someone's disability or their age, or whatnot. And so, just to put something, out there that it's not really getting, it needs to be made aware of even more.
Well, and there's also that concern. I had a nurse, actually, a friend of mine that works at UMC, that reached out to me to ask me what kind of rules there were in place for some of the hospitals, not their hospital in particular, but they had a client that had gone to get medical care somewhere and they were non-verbal. And the concern was that their caregiver was not allowed to go with them. And that's actually something, and I did address that with Disability Rights Texas, because if you are a person that needs that, they have to allow you to bring your provider or caregiver with you if you are not a person that could speak for yourself. You know, when you're initially gone. I know that the rules are so tight right now because they don't want extra people. But if you can't speak for yourself, there's that fear that they'll just decide. They could just say, well, you know, they said this or they wanted that. And so there's a real concern in the disability community and also with parents of children with disabilities that somebody might decide that their loved one doesn't have the desired quality of life to qualify for treatment for COVID. And it brings up the whole issue of eugenics. It's just really a scary thing that needs to be addressed. And maybe as advocates, we can reach out to our local hospitals and find out, what is your policy for this? And if they have a policy where they're going to make that choice, then we need to publicize it so that if you are a person with a disability, you don't go to that hospital, you know, because it's a matter of life or death.
This, Anita, I experienced a hospitalization a few weeks ago where I'm disabled, I'm a fall risk, everything like that. And the hospital would not allow any visitors, would not allow my wife, you know, to come and help me. They insisted that I wait on them to do things. And that didn't work out so well for me. And so, and even though the rule was in at that time that if you are disabled, you know, your caregivers could come in, the hospital made a policy that said, no, we don't care. We don't, no visitors whatsoever. And that happened to me, someone with a disability who can speak up for myself, who can advocate for myself. Imagine, you know, where people who are nonverbal or who have significant disability, who wouldn't even be listened to even if they tried to communicate. Imagine that. And this happened to me, and I'm a well-known advocate. I can advocate for myself, you know, so yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're getting close to 8:30, and so I really appreciate your time. And if you have any parting thoughts, I'd really appreciate them.
I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. I appreciate that you are a genuine person. And I want to do whatever I can to help get you elected, because we really need a mayor that not only has awareness, but that cares about these things, because that's the only way El Paso is going to move forward. We need an inclusive El Paso. And whether it be by disabilities, race, sexual orientation, gender, that's what we need as a city. You know, we have a large Latino presence. I mean, I think as Latinos, I feel like we're naturally inclusive in that sense. And I really want you to know that I completely support you. And I'm really glad and honored that you asked me to be a part of this. So thank you, Veronica.
Thank you. You always bring a wealth of information to all our conversations. So I had to have you on here.
This, Anita, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me. I'm an outsider, okay? But I wanted to thank you for inviting me and giving me, you know, the opportunity to share some views and share my memories of Frank. And, you know, I totally appreciate, you know, what you are doing. And I tell you, I gotta say, if I were in El Paso, hey, you know, I'd be definitely working on your campaign, you know. But again, thank you so much. I totally appreciate your having me. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. And you came highly recommended. People were very excited that you said yes to joining us. You have such a long history, and so many people across the country have benefited from your fearlessness, along with Frank's, along with so many other people. What you did to bring access and equality and really a voice to these issues is just immeasurable. So thank you for all of the work that you have done to make our country more just. Thank you.
And
want to say,
thank you for those that recommended me. Thank
I
you.
also want to say thank you, Ms. Carvajal, because I've been in a very fortunate position where I've done through the Accessibility Corner, the internet show, and Facebook live show, the opportunity to talk to politicians that are running for election or candidates that are running for election, either on the national, the local, and the state level. And one thing that, and I told you this before, one thing that I did notice you off the bat is, well, let me go back a little bit. Me being visually impaired, I don't take the normal cues as anyone else, like, facial, like if let's say you're disinterested or you start wandering your eyes, I could see that, right? I do in a different context where I hear you. So I could hear if you're paying attention, if you're not, if you really, give a darn, or if you don't. And I can honestly say in my experience, and I told you this before, that you really do care. You really do have that intuition of people with disabilities, what we're going through. And that thing that has to do a lot with your selflessness of being working in a nonprofit. Because I don't know if you people that who are watching know that Miss Carvajal graduated from an Ivy League school. She could have gone to New York, Atlanta, Dallas, to the big stores, the big cities to make that money. But she came back to El Paso to help our people. And that's what I'm saying. That in my opinion, and you'll be the best candidate for mayor because you understand us, and I fully support you. And I thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, George.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Hi, this is Josue. I just want to thank you for having us and taking the time to listen to us. And I do want to leave off by making a kind of weird request once you become mayor. I think that it would be, I know that George and all of us have mentioned the meetings we used to have with the mayor, and those were always great. And if those could return, that'd be awesome. But another thing that I would like to request from you, as far as doing some type of changes would be, we currently have an accessibility advisory committee for the city. If there was any way in which you could actually give that committee some teeth per se, once you're elected, that would be greatly appreciated, because a lot of people go to those meetings, the public goes to those meetings, and it'd be great to actually be able to say that committee itself is a committee to go to, where people can talk to the people from that represent each of the districts in El Paso, and to actually be able to have a voice that has an impact on decisions that the city makes. I think that would be a great step to push for and to start with.
Thank you. I feel the same way about the Fair Housing Task Force, because in El Paso, what we see the most in terms of discrimination, it's primarily based on disability, both physical and mental. And so I think those two task forces and committees need to have, like you said, more teeth to actually get things done.
Ms. Carvajal, I just want to say real fast about the housing. I forgot to mention this earlier. I do want to mention this, that when I applied for housing for an apartment in Montana, at that time, my vision was to the point where I was using very thick glasses, but I could still see. So I went to apply. I was working at the time, so I met the threshold of income. I had no criminal background, and my credit was good. I'm like, wow, I didn't get they call me and you didn't qualify. I'm like, huh, okay. So I went back to talk to the gentleman because I kind of knew him. And I'm like, hey, what happened? Why did I get denied? Because I was kind of offended, right? Because, I thought I qualified. And he's like, you know what? Let's go outside. I want to talk to you. I'm like, all right. Because you know why you didn't get the apartment? I'm like, why? Because the manager was afraid that you might burn it down because you can't see. I'm like, really? And that's the very, very first time in my life that I felt discrimination. And I was like, wow, that's sad, But again, that goes back to perception.
Yes. Yes, and it goes back to enforcement
Yeah.
and having a testing program where people can test, because you were, in some ways you had more information than the average El Pasoan. I have a lot of clients who use support animals. And so I tell them, don't take the animal if you can, don't take the animal to the appointment to the apartment complex. Because once you get in, you bring in your animal like you would bring in your medication. They can't ask you about either of those things. And so, because we don't have a testing program, we don't have a way to keep landlords honest, so that they don't think about, these stigmas and biases in a way that impedes people from accessing housing, which we've talked about is a huge issue for people with disabilities. Charles, would you like to say something before we leave?
Yes, I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Also, just to emphasize that deaf people do value communication just like anybody else. We like to go to restaurants, to the movies, to things, but we do require equal access to get that information, So we do really appreciate and enjoy the same things. And I just want to invite everybody to be open-minded. We can gesture, you know what? I can't speak, obviously, and I can't hear. So I require accommodations, but I can also accommodate myself. I can text, I can write back and forth. I can accommodate my needs too. But thank you for your time and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. And I want to thank all the clients that I've had. I think I learned about disability issues when I became a legal aid lawyer. Like right off the bat, so many of my clients had some sort of disability, either acquired at birth or because they worked very tough physical jobs and became disabled as adults. And so I've learned so much about my own misperceptions about people with disabilities, and have had to really think about how do we provide services in a way that is accessible to people in terms of communications, in terms of privacy. When you are in a legal setting or in a doctor's office, people are still entitled to have some privacy. So yes, maybe they want to come in with their caregiver, but maybe they don't want to come in with their parent and talk about, some legal issue. And the fact is that you cannot skirt around that person's right to privacy. You have to get them an interpreter if that's the issue. You have to accommodate if there's, if it's something else, because everyone's entitled to choose and to have that kind of freedom. And so I've learned a lot just by working with people throughout the years. Because we're not all born understanding, right? I've learned a lot from every single one of you. I've learned to change the way that I do things. And through the campaign, we're always learning. And I'm always nervous that George is going to text me or call me and say I did it wrong. But we are trying. Even today was a little bit, we had some hiccups, and these platforms are still not ideal. We understand that. We still have so much to learn and to implement. But I think the technology is hopefully catching up so that we can make things accessible to people, especially in these kinds of forums, people who cannot hear us. So we're learning and we're trying. So thank you for your patience and for being here today. I hope that people learned a lot as I did, and that if they didn't watch right now, they can watch later and watch it a few times. You have made some really, really important recommendations to the city. I think I have found that when we invest in what we think of as accommodations, we get so much more in return. We get participation, we get respect, we avoid injuries. There's so many things that we do. And more than that, I think we create a community that's much more compassionate, because none of us are immune from becoming disabled. It could happen to any single one of us from an injury or from an illness. And so we don't think about that until you break your leg, or until you have some disorder that really impacts your ability to get around. or to hear, or to be heard. And so I hope that this has been enlightening, and I hope that we can create some policy changes. Whether or not I'm elected, I hope that other people who are running are also paying attention to these issues, because it will make us a better city, especially because we do have a lot of veterans, and many of our veterans have, because of their service, have physical and mental disabilities that we need to be able to accommodate and respond to. So I appreciate everyone's time. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. And thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom with us. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.